Welcome to Peer Check. I'm your host, Adam Keating, and today we're talking about the future of connected PLM and the role that systems of engagement will play. I'm joined by the virtual Dutchman, a PLM expert, Jos Voskuil. He's been in the PLM space for 20 plus years, as a translator and coach, helping teams figure out how to connect the business and technical side together, and then also someone sharing knowledge. And you'll find him on the internet sharing blogs for the last 15 years. Jos, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for having me in this interesting series of podcasts. I discovered it also recently, and I'm really enjoying them, some of the speakers. So I'm glad I can contribute to the picture of the future in modern media.
I love it. Before we jump in, I got to know where the nickname Virtual Dutchman came from. Give me the background. How did you end up there? Because when I Google that, I find you immediately, which I think is pretty crazy.
Okay, well, interesting enough, before I started my blog in 2008, I was traveling around the world, hired by Smart Team, Dassault, IBM, and other PLM implementers to mediate. And although I was a Dutchman, I was flying all around the world, and I was thinking about the Flying Dutchman. But then I realized I'm not at home at all, so I'm a virtual Dutchman because I'm everywhere around the world. And later, I think recently, the choice for virtual is even more significant for the type of business we are in. So it was a lucky choice at that time to choose virtual Dutchman for my blog.
You were ahead of your time. You knew that we were shifting into this cloud-based virtual world.
At that time, I was more thinking about being a virtual citizen. I was full for globalization at that time.
Awesome. Yeah, you were a nomad. I'm curious then, like in the 20 years of like getting in the PLM space, you've spent more time than almost anyone I've seen thinking about this. Why PLM? What got you into PLM being the hook for your career and the thing that you've chose to educate people on?
Yeah, it's a good question because initially I didn't want to start with PLM. I started my company in '99 called Tacit with a focus on knowledge management, tacit knowledge.
Okay.
That was the knowledge an expert had compared to explicit knowledge. And I was fascinated by the brain. So if you look at my company logo, there is also the brain inside. But then I got dragged into my old contacts. I knew Smart Team from 1995, and they asked me to help them in some projects. And for me, PLM is a kind of knowledge management too. So I rolled into this type of activities, and I discovered the most of the fun comes from the people, the interaction, the culture. And yes, there is technology, but it has still had to do for me a lot with knowledge management, and that's why I still enjoy developing it.
I'm curious on that front. Like getting in coaching is like one thing, but spending time doing the type of research that you've done and putting that together into a medium someone can actually, learn from is a whole other difficult task. Why did you start the blog? Like, what was the inspiration behind starting the PLM blog?
Well, initially when I started my PLM blog, I discovered that nobody was interested in when a problem was solved when I was flying around the world. Because if it was an R&D problem, R&D was happy. If it was a sales, then sales or the customer. And then I said, okay, we need to capitalize this type of knowledge, especially for the small and medium enterprises, because there is only the academical books, and
Mm,
for the rest there is nothing, or there is vendor information. And by doing this job, I also discovered it's a learning process and it's continuous learning. I
mm,
was not as mature as I was in 2008, and also my opinion is changing. And that's the beautiful role I had as a coach and a mediator. You see so many implementations, you follow so
mm.
many implementations. So it's a continuous learning process, and till now it hasn't stopped. That's the good news, I think. And
I
and
think
that's
that I think the really beautiful part is it's created these conversations. Like I think I've seen every post you've made, there's 5, 10, 15, 20 people getting in and commenting about concepts. And they're not just small companies. Like I'm seeing like large companies who, do have the money, who are coming to you now, 15 years later, with blogs that you might have written 5 years ago that are still completely relevant, which I think is super cool. And I'm going to dive into a couple of those now in a moment.
and maybe the other point is I've been a teacher in physics before,
Mm,
and I also learned from blogging you have to explain things simple. You
Yeah.
don't use too many academic terms, and also by blogging, you learn to understand how things are connected, because I'm thinking continuously, how is this fitting in a bigger picture? And if I wouldn't have done the blogging, I might have sitting down in one or two big projects and not get this understanding.
No, that's cool. I like how too when you do your blogs, it's not just like a little nugget of a topic and then something completely different. I think one of the unique things that you've done, like the series you had here, the road to model base and the connected PLM, like there's 9 parts to that blog. Each of them builds upon the other. I really like I think it was blog 3 and 4 in that series where you start pulling out like a thought, and one of those thoughts you had was that data driven does not imply there needs to be a single environment, a single database that contains all information. It's about managing connected data sets that are federated. And it's not about owning the data, it's about accessing reliable data. And you took the whole blog around that. And that's actually my very first question. Like I think you think about PLM, when I got into engineering, 10 years ago, all I heard was single source of truth. That was the only thing I heard. It was like drilled into my head. And I think today I still hear it quite a lot. Why take that stance? Like, what drove you to feel strongly about, this connected, federated environment versus like a single source where everything pipes into? Just to talk me through the inspiration behind that.
Okay, so let me first be more precise. When I talk about data, I mean data sets stored in a database, and they can be combined with meaningful information depending on their status and their relations. And also, geometry shapes are pieces of information with properties you can store in a database. And the advantage of this approach is that all the data can be accessed without going through people or through system silos, which is very much the traditional single source of truth concept.
Yeah.
You dump your or you store your deliverable in a certain place, and then you think it's accessible for everyone. But first of all, most of the time, only the owner of the data set knows if it's reliable, or of the document. Where in data sets, you're not longer the owner, you're accountable for the information, but anyone who has authorized access can use this information in their context. And that makes it completely different, the concept. And then if you keep on thinking, would I like to have everything in a single database? Maybe some vendors are dreaming about that, but even SAP discovered they cannot do the full PLM scope anymore. So I think we've seen it's a mission impossible, and we have to think about federated data, also because we don't need people to interface. If we have connected data sets, we don't need the guards or the people that are transferring data. And then, and I come back to my brain analogy. The brain works the same. The brain is a kind of place where you store the logical connections. But when you find the details, you go to a federated environment where you look into the details and you make your conclusions. And then also your brain will discover there is no single source of truth in the world. There is always the nearest source of truth, depending on the context that you explore. And that's, I think, also coming back to the brain, exactly what Daniel Kahneman also says in his Thinking Fast and Slow. We always want to think fast, but then we go to the easy sources, but we need to be more precise and think in a federated way and more detailed.
So there's a couple things I want to unpack there. One is like the data set side aside, like I think that makes sense. The argument I hear often is we've got multiple vendors, sets of tools that don't plug well together, so we want to migrate to something. Like I recently heard from a big company that they invested $100 million to move all of their PLMs across all of their 65 sites to one PLM. It failed. They ended up canceling the initiative, and they ultimately never did it. But that thought process, right, to go all up to your C-suite and look for $100 million to make this happen, people are worried about this. What's like your advice to someone in a leadership role or a digitization role around how to get buy-in on keeping multiple, databases and just focusing on how they connect together? How do they even start that conversation?
Yeah, well, so this is very much the discussion I recently had about system of record and system of engagement. If you look to companies, their traditional approach was to provide a backbone for everyone where you store your information, your systems of record. And this is relative efficient for traditional companies. But now, when we are getting into more digitalization and much more complex products, we cannot work in the same way anymore. We have to work in multidisciplinary teams, and we have to be more holistic because we are not just working inside our silo. And it's a different type of working. It's a different type of data, and you need different type of people. And that's where usually the crash at management level starts.
Mm.
They want to simplify it into one system again, in just an evolution process of people, instead of ignoring that people from my generation were grown up analog and the new generation is digital, and that processes are not longer the mechanical release linear process, but it's much more iterative. So there is so much, I would say, tension at the management level if you really want to understand what is the future. And therefore, one of my how to say points is don't migrate. Try to keep your system of record in place and create new environments with new people, and try to connect and share where possible, depending on your product life cycle, of course. And,
Well,
and this concept is slowly getting understood at management level. That is not so simple to just migrate a system to a single system, like you mentioned in your example. It will fail.
one of the things that I think is interesting is like we've talked about this like single source of truth, idea for a decade or more. But the truth is there never was one, right? Like big manufacturers have at a minimum a PLM and an ERP, and right away that already is two systems. And even if that's all you had, which we know is not true, you've already got multiple record sources that need to be tied together. One of the things that I'm curious about from your perspective is the vendors themselves. There's only really a handful of big vendors that provide PLM solutions. They don't make it super easy to plug into one PLM into the other. And some would argue that the strategy from a business perspective is to not actually allow the others to plug into each other. Do you see pressure coming from customers to the big players, Dassault and Siemens and PTC, to open up APIs like the software world? Like, what do you think is going to happen there? Because today it's hard. Like, it's time consuming. It's a slog. Like, how do you get there?
Yeah. So I don't blame the PLM companies because they have to be profitable also. That's the first
Yeah.
point. And I learned from working with Smart Team, which had a public API open and you could build anything. They couldn't maintain enough profitability to maintain the product. Technology changes. So you need to have a kind of revenue model as a PLM company, either through your API, through your openings. But first of all, yeah, would you change a profitable business model which you control? Probably not. It's like asking oil and gas companies to be more sustainable. And why would they change? Because at this moment, who is pushing for an open architecture? It's not the management. It's coming from users that discover it. Often, when you are very close to software, you discover the benefits of open architectures. But there is nobody on management level that has the education or the holistic view of the future. And so they will choose for what they know, which is a system backbone, preferably from one of the big vendors, because then you cannot be blamed for the wrong choice. And slowly, I will say we will improve, because I think it will not happen bottom up, but a new generation of management will start to understand and start to push and also illustrate the need for more openness, because there is no single closed system that is good enough for managing a connected enterprise.
No, you end up with like a slightly dull Swiss Army knife, and there's so many functions, right? PLM itself is so complicated as it is. Like it does so many important things. And one of the things that I actually said was, if you think about your system of record, you don't necessarily want that to be the easiest place in the world to do your work because it's the place you're making decisions. It's the place that you're relying on the data from. It's the place that you're trying to control what's going on so that bad things don't happen downstream. And if that's super easy, which is what you want in an engagement system, things are going to go astray. So it's a hard balance between, even if we could get it all in one place, may not make sense.
But as you look to the system of record approach, it took a long time to get this implemented. Before, in the early days of PLM, people said, okay, we have an ERP system, and if you want to do something more with intelligence around product, please use the PLM functionality from the ERP, or we add some customization to connect to ERP. I think now at this stage we see that ERP and PLM are accepted as two infrastructures for managing enterprise and product data. And now we are in the next wave. Because of digitalization, we are also able to connect people not necessarily in their disciplines and to govern the process of their following, but we are creating environments for collaboration, and preferably multidisciplinary. The connection of simulation and design is very strong if it happens in real time instead of in a serial phase. The same for engineering and manufacturing preparation. If you do it in a serial mode, you lose time. So this kind of environments were never envisioned in the traditional PLM backbone. I mean, model-based definition is already quite accepted in the automotive and aerospace industry. Still, we talk about packages exchanges to the different backbones because there is no connected infrastructure. And I think this is the process where we are now for the next 10 years. Now we have to fight for the connected infrastructure, which is not a single system, it's a set of connected systems. And the value comes from the connectivity from the stream of information.
I'm curious on two parts to dig into. Before we leave the PLM side and get into some of the engagement system side, you said something a moment ago that years ago, PLM was not accepted, and people told them to say, take your ERP and use the PLM functionality. I think we hear a lot of that today about systems of engagement and PLM. Because it's a new topic, people don't fully understand it. What got people over the line that PLM deserved a pillar inside of a big organization, however many years ago that happened? What was it that changed?
I think it in the engagements that I did was following the logic of product design and product data. Where is it created? When you have a conceptual part, why should you go to an ERP system to request a part number? Or why can't you ask a part number because you want to save the 7 digits for only manufacturing parts? So showing the lack of logic in the business flow was a reason to explain, look, this is the more natural flow without thinking in systems to develop a product. And then you see that even if the ERP system has a PLM module, it's not designed for work in progress. It's not designed for conceptual thinking. And more, from there the term virtual, we're moving to the virtual enterprise before we go to ERP. So companies that I would say are aware of those trends, they see, yes, we need to invest much more in the front end of product design, because that's where the costs are defined, that's where the behavior is defined, than in the execution part. And then the second point that also contributed to the acceptance of PLM was the fact that companies started to have multiple manufacturing locations, where initially, of course, the ERP vendor says, if you standardize on our ERP, everywhere is the same. But of course, the plants are everywhere different, the local purchasing is different. But the product definition, you would like to centralize. So you need to have a centralized environment where you push your product definition to the local ERPs. And those are I think, two major trends that led to the fact that PLM became visible outside the engineering environment as a tool for engineers.
That's cool. I think we're seeing that now in the transition to what is the next step in evolution of tools. Like you wrote something in your blog that talked about, in the 60s we were age of paper drawings, then electronic drawings, then 3D CAD, and now we're moving towards this like much more data centric, item centric, model based system. Which I thought I saw one of your blogs a comment about how people interpret model based to just be 3D and it being
Right.
actually more than just 3D. There's a whole bunch of acronyms that are very very close in this space, but I think that makes a lot of sense. The question I have for you is when we started Colab 4-ish years ago, I remember speaking with an analyst and they talked about product innovation platforms, the
Hmm.
PIP, and I saw that in one of your blogs. I feel like that conversation has slowed a little bit. There still is that, right? 3D experience, you could argue, is the essence of what that was. But now there's starting to be a ton of like standalone, very focused systems of engagement that plug into other tools. Like you mentioned OpenBOM with Oleg, and like what we're doing with Colab, and then there's SimScale on the FE side. There's lots of stuff happening. Which path do you think is actually going to take system engagement train? Is it going to be bolted into the big PLM and something bigger, or is it going to be PLM with a whole bunch of very specific systems of engagement tied to it?
Yeah. So I think you still need a kind of backbone as a system of record, because even with your systems of engagement, you will have to publish at a certain moment your results to the enterprise for traditional auditing or manufacturing processes. So the existing system of records, they need to be preferably open enough to
Mm-hmm.
be able to receive this kind of domain-specific packages, or even preferably they are connected. But then you have the challenge if they are connected, which data do you put in your connection? And that's, for example, the big difference. If you look at the 3D Experience platform, they try to be one data model, where PTC and Siemens, they have a kind of PLM backbone, and they create interfaces from the different tools to this backbone. Of course, interfaces are more limited than a connected data model where you can create everything. But the question is, yeah, how far do you need to go to connect everything to everything? And that's where
Yeah.
this discussion about a federated enterprise comes from. Your domains need to be optimum designed for the end users and the work in progress, but they need to have a kind of gateway to publish to a system of record. And preferably, are those gateways standardized? I think that's the concept I have in mind when I think about the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. If you look at like the end user, you need to think about who those people are. They're likely getting pressured to do more right now with less in like a fraction of the time, and them trying to sift through a bunch of data makes it hard. It's the reason why, like you see in automotive, like an open issues list, lots of companies are still using homegrown stuff or they're using spreadsheets and stuff that doesn't. It's because it's easier, not because it's better. It's just easier for them to do because there's so much inside the PLM to actually unpack, which I think is the danger in having too much of it because then you get the same problem in your system engagement, which then you've ultimately failed.
And and the biggest challenge is in people, because also with the discussion
Mm.
with Oleg to replace Excel by the BOM. But
Yeah.
the beauty of an Excel is you control it fully. Everything is there and you have it. Nothing can happen to it. But if your Excel suddenly becomes a shareable environment where people can change information, where people can add information, then you lose your feeling of control.
Hmm.
And that's an attitude that has to change. We have to learn to be accountable for data, but not the ones that control the data. And that's why systems of engagement should focus on multidisciplinary collaboration, not a single discipline, because then it's a system tool. But if it's a system of engagement, yeah, you benefit from that other people share the data, contribute to the data, and understand what is happening. And that's where the real big benefits are.
Yeah, and on that front, like talking about the systems of engagement, I think most times, like I liked what you wrote in your blog about it's not going to be a system of engagement. There's going to be many. And I think
Yeah.
that's true. Like look at GitHub in the software world and the ecosystem around GitHub. I would argue it's not even systems of engagement. They've got systems of automation, they've got little plugins, they've got full engagement tools, they've got a million things. And that's also true in the sales world. Salesforce has literally Sales Loft right on top of
Yeah.
it, which if you look at like what Colab was trying to be to PLM, almost identical positioning. And there's more than just Sales Loft, right? There's Gong and there's all these other tools. And it's because this data is important in Salesforce, but it's hard to use. Like it's hard
Yeah.
to use day to day. I'm curious, like for engineering leader, like where to start? Is it architecture first? Is it people problem first? Like this is an overwhelming situation now. Like where do you actually start unpacking the
Yeah.
information from?
I think from my personal experience, it all starts with educating and experimenting yourself. Because if you have faced the problem, if you have understood the problem, then at least you can also probably define what is the next step and what is the vision. I mean, the first time I worked with Google Docs and somebody was changing my text or adding my text, that was a realization. Yes, you can work together in this way. So I don't have to wait till my form is filled and I send it by email. So this is a kind of experience that people have to go through, and also as an organization. So if you work in a team, don't accept if somebody says, I will email you or I will send you an update when I'm ready. No, you want to have continuous real-time information and visibility. And as an engineering leader, if you're able to implement this for design of simulation relation, or for example design to manufacturing relation, then you start learning the process. And that's why I said model-based definition is a very nice first step of learning the future. Eh, because
Hmm.
it's a little bit mature already, the processes,
Hmm.
thanks to automotive and aerospace, but there is still so much to learn. But the same could be also done with design and simulation integration, or later with service or supplier interaction. So pick your area where you have the biggest gain to expect by working differently, and start to imagine the process in the future. And don't do it at once, do it with minimum viable products, deliveries,
Hmm.
and learn and improve while doing. But don't do a proof of concept, because a proof of concept is something like it's not really committed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you say that. Those two things that I was just going to ask you. POC is something I hear constantly. And one of the things that you just said is so true. If you're not bought in to making a change, even if it's the tool, it's okay if the tool you pick is not the right one. But if you're not bought into the change, the time and money you invest is just a huge waste because there's going to be something that comes up and it's easy to stop. And it's a decision if you just keep pumping through it or not to actually get there. And I liked what you said about like starting with like a nugget and iterating from there and growing because that's not the way PLM has been rolled out for the last 15 years. Most times it's like 4 year big implementation windows that are very complicated. And that's why that $100 million example I gave you never happened.
Although I have the feeling that this type of implementations are also getting less and less, because companies that should have invested in traditional PLM, they have done now their final technology upgrade. Now the battle is really on the best systems of engagement. And, and here also we have to realize that organizations can be working in a hybrid mode with systems of record and system of engagement, but make sure your people don't work hybrid. If they are committed for the future or they are committed for the system of record approach.
Yeah.
But if they have to work in two ways, it's like the same for you. If you cannot focus on your job, it will be half half.
Yeah, there's something I tell my team all the time. If you're split, you're not 50% effective in both. You're like 10% effective in both because the switching cost is so high that it
Right.
just hurts every bit of it. Um, I want to ask you just one thing about PLM before I just lead into a couple of final thoughts here. You said something just then about the system of record. Most of them have matured that process. And I think that's true in the big enterprise. And most of the small companies are going to do something different anyways because they didn't
Hmm.
want to spend the money and invest. Do you feel that most big companies, automotive, aerospace, industrials, medical, have basically married themselves to their infrastructure, like the underlying system of record infrastructure for the most part, for the next 10, 20 plus years?
I think the system of records will remain relative stable unless there is a technology change. I've seen some big companies running on mainframes saying, okay, this technology gets outdated. Let's see if we can do the same data model or even a medium data model on modern technology. But the big shift of data driven is not part of this change. It's more underlying infrastructure and trying to keep as much as possible the same ways of working. And sometimes it might be a pricing issue. I've seen a customer that the cost of maintenance of the mainframes was so high that they say that it makes sense to change technology. But yeah, as I said, I don't expect big changes on this approach. And the medium enterprises, yeah, they are always already kind of system engagement mode because the interaction, the collaboration is possible in a small company, and a lot is done in the brain. And yeah, what do you want to store outside the brain? That's the question. Huh?
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I'm curious, just last thought here on the model-based, enterprise and the model-based definition approach. Auto, aerospace, and defense are ahead in that game. What does the like MBD lens for you offer to the brain that you think gives people like that next set of, ideas for system engagement? Like, why is it that MBD is like that knowledge system, like that way of rewiring your brain? Why do you think that that's the path to it?
Yeah. So first of all, I don't think that automotive and aerospace are ahead of the game,
Okay.
but they are ahead of the game in model-based definition because they rely heavily on exchanging in an efficient manner data with suppliers, and then you see that the traditional way of working with drawings, with documents, is too much time-consuming. It creates errors. So they learned an efficient way to exchange a model with its related data. So a kind of mini concept of data-driven. But aerospace is not so innovative. Automotive is not so innovative. What is innovative is Tesla, which is software on wheels. But the traditional car manufacturers, they don't innovate so much also. They try to make it now based on batteries. So the real innovation of model-based approach is about having different data entries as the legal entity. So here in model-based definition, the 3D model is the central entity, and you connect all the information. But in, for example, model-based system engineering, you might have simulation models, both a logical model that before you even have a physical model that controls the behavior of the product or the system that you and there you see there are so many different parts of models, your manufacturing model, your operation model, that it's not a single environment anymore. But they all need reliable data, and they need direct access to the data and not through people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. We onboarded a new person on our team today, and in the simple sense, the main thing we were talking about was how do we do even a better job as a software company, connecting them to the right data so there wasn't gatekeepers in between. And this is like, a relatively small software tech company, and we still are talking about how do you advance that. And I think when you step back 10 steps to the engineering world, it's even harder, right? You never know which is the right revision, which configuration are you working from, like what's changed, how a decision was made is so hard to know. But I think the key takeaway from this discussion here is that thinking about open architecture, federated model, connecting it so you have the right data to do the right job at the right time for the right person, like that's the way this is moving. It's hard, but start small. Start with
Yeah,
a nugget, start with a place and move from there.
yeah. And one interesting thing I learned recently, the data need to be 100% accurate. And that's why you need accountable people, because if you want to run algorithms on non-accurate data, you get worse results.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, but
And
also
that, and
your algorithms, I mean, if the data is not correct, you will create a mess and people will not trust the system and therefore fall back on what they did before.
yeah, I was just gonna say it's all trust. Like this whole thing
Yeah,
is trust when
yeah.
it comes back to it. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jos, for being here today. Like, I really appreciate the perspective. and I'm looking forward to the next, 5, 10, 20 years of blogs. I don't know how many years you're going to keep making blogs, but I'll be there checking it out and appreciate it.
Yeah, it will be a challenge. I mean, the next 10 years are going to be quite decisive, I think, for data-driven environments if we're going to make the breakthrough. But yeah, there is so much learning to do. Huh? If there was a blueprint already that we could use, then it would be easy. But
We,
we're all
we, we,
learning.
we'd be retired and on a beach somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, you may be earlier than me. Huh?
All right, well, we'll try to figure it out together.
I mean, the beach doesn't look like the most exciting place to retire.
All right, we'll find another place, a mountain or something cool in between.
Okay. Okay,
Awesome.
but yeah, thanks for this interesting discussion, because I think this is what we should have around the world, and for sure, I'm looking forward to follow-up discussions if needed.
Awesome. Thank you very much.